Your short-term memory is referred to as the working memory because there is limited capacity. However, it is much more capable in terms of both time and the amount of data retaining it than your immediate memory was. Data is going to remain for about 30 seconds in your short-term memory. You will lose it if you don't rehearse this data. Short-term memory skills are very important for your conversational effectiveness. If you're not able to engage in perception checking, if you're not able to refer back to comments that the other person has made and recall when they've answered questions or when they've given you information later on, you really have a hard time having an effective conversation with another individual, and then you'd have a hard time building meaningful long-term relationships with that person. Those that have difficulties with their short-term memory, because maybe they suffer from a particular disease like Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia, they experience a lot of negative consequences in their relationships. They have a difficult time because what happens in their relationships is someone will give them some information and 5 minutes later they'll ask the same question they asked earlier and they can't remember that information. It can be frustrating to the person that they're asking, but it can also be very frustrating to them when they realize that something's wrong, and that can affect their even desire to engage in conversations with other people. Now, your short-term memory can be enhanced through repetition, chunking, and identification of logical patterns. We're going to make some applications here. I have a number for you, which seems pretty random, 4580-253-976. Now, this number is actually one that I had memorized in a graduate class. I had a professor who was trying to prove a point with memory, and he had us act crazy as we repeated this number over and over again. We got on desks and stood up. We raised our hands. We squatted down. We said it loud. We said it softly. We said it at a medium volume level. But by the end of that class, I had this number memorized. And 8 years later, I can still recall this number. As we apply repetition, you can do exactly what that professor did. You can say the number over and over and over again, and you can do it in different ways. So you can have different body movements, you can do it with different volume levels, pitch, a variety of things in order to engage in repetition and enhance the aspects of repetition. Also, you can chunk information. This number looks like a telephone number, so you could say area code, prefix, and then your 4 last digits. Or you can put it into 4 numbers, basically 45, 80, 253, 976. So rather than a lot of different numbers, you only have 4 basically numbers to memorize. You can also create a logical pattern. Even though one might not seem apparent at first, when I looked at this number after a given period of time, actually trying to figure out a way that there was a logical pattern here to use this as an example, I figured out very quickly that you have an even number, an odd number, then 3 even numbers, 3 odd numbers, and the pattern could start over again. Even, but we stop there because we don't have any more numbers left. So even in something that seems illogical, you might be able to find a logical pattern. These are ways to enhance your short-term memory. But in order to transition information and the stimuli that you've inputted in your short-term memory into your long-term memory, you're going to have to engage in active manipulation. That means you have to be intentional in the way you process information. If you're not going to be deliberate, then you're not going to be able to have the necessary associations to the input in order to be able to retrieve that information later. So let's talk about your long-term memory. Long-term memory is referred to as a data bank or a warehouse because this is one of the coolest things. It has limitless capacity. You can store limitless amount of information in your long-term memory as long as you're able to put associations with the input that will help you to retrieve it later. With that said though, your long-term memory has both slower time in terms of the time it takes you to input information and the time it's going to take you to retrieve that information. What helps us with our long-term memory and affects our ability to recall information is going to be the recipes that we use. Carl Weick refers to our memory in terms of recipes, and that is we have recipes for how to do certain skills, for certain interactions, or you might even call these scripts. I like the word recipes because it recalls food to my mind, and I like food. And this is a really good illustration. I have a recipe for chocolate pie. and it is one of those recipes that came from a grandmother's cookbook. And this recipe I have done so many times, repeated it over and over again, it is inputted in my long-term memory. So when I receive new inputs in regard to chocolate pie, I'm going to compare the new recipes to my existing old recipe. And I may modify my old recipe to try something new out, or I might disregard the new recipe because it's too different from my old recipe. And so we engage in comparison and contrast. Organizational schema theory really helps to explain this process. That is, we develop hierarchies of information. We develop different categories, and our different categories have depth to them. Like my category for chocolate pie has a lot of depth to it because I've been cooking chocolate pie for a long time, and I read a lot of magazines and cookbooks that have recipes in them. And so I have a mental model for the way chocolate pie is made, and all incoming information is comparative to that. The more developed our schema are, the easier it is for us to understand new information and to input it into long-term memory. The less developed a schema is on a particular issue or idea or concept, well, the less likely it is for us to understand it and to input it into long-term memory. A good example is if you were to stick me into a calculus class. It's been 10 years since I took calculus. So, I imagine I'd be quite lost in a calculus class. If I sat down, everything that I would hear would seem very new to me. It would be very confusing because I haven't taken a math course in a very long time. And I would struggle to understand, much less to be able to recall that information. It's because I don't have a lot of depth to the schema related to calculus. Now, what happens with our schema is that we have some incoming data that we would maybe label as weak, and that data then is conformed to fit existing schema. A good example is this: is maybe you have a good friend and you talk politics with them all the time. You know who they voted for in the last election, you know what their ideas are on certain social issues, and as you're hearing them talk, what you do is you conform what you're listening to your already existing ideas about their political beliefs. And maybe they've changed slightly. Maybe they're even questioning some of their choices politically. Yet, you may not even recognize that or pick up on it because it doesn't fit with what you already know. However, when you have a strong structure for data, it can really alter or reinforce maybe an existing schema that you have, and it may even create a new schema depending on the strength of that data. Your schema are constantly changing. They are not stuck in stone. Just because you have one recipe for chocolate pie or you think your friend has a particular set of political beliefs does not mean that you won't change your schema over time. A really good illustration of this is the schema that you have for an ideal mate. You have thoughts of what that person is like, their personality, the choices that they make, their moral code, maybe even what they look like. And you compare incoming data, that is people that you meet, with that existing schema. But that is not to say that your idea of an ideal mate will be the same 2 years from now as it is today. In fact, it will probably change as you interact with people, and through those interactions, you alter your schema. And that's how life is. Now, we also need to explore how you can improve upon your long-term memory, which we'll do next.